Okay, so have you ever like been in that situation where you run into somebody that you met like at a conference or something
Mm-hmm.
and you completely forgot their name
Oh, yeah.
and it's like super awkward?
Definitely.
Well, that's kind of what we're going to be diving into today.
Oh, cool.
Um, we're going to be looking at a real-world conversation in English where that exact thing happens
Okay.
and kind of picking it apart and seeing what we can learn from it.
Sounds good.
So, the basic situation is there are these two people, Nick and Anna, and they met at a conference.
Right.
And then they run into each other kind of randomly afterwards,
Good.
and Nick has totally forgotten Anna's name.
Oh, no.
But instead of just like panicking or avoiding her,
Hey.
he tries to kind of just play it cool
I see.
and starts chatting with her.
Okay.
So he starts with a really casual, like, how's it going?
Yeah, that's a very typical way to start a conversation.
Yeah, very natural and informal.
Exactly.
Now, here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Nick's next move is he drops the I'm in a bit of a hurry line. I think we've all used that one.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good way to, like, if you need to escape a conversation.
Exactly.
Politely.
Without seeming rude.
Right.
But then it gets really awkward because he has to admit that he's forgotten her name.
Oh.
And he says that it slipped his mind.
Oh, yeah.
I love that phrase.
That's a good one.
Like her name just disappeared into thin air.
Yeah, it's a common idiom in English.
Even for native speakers.
Oh, yeah. We use it all the time.
It shows that, like, forgetting names is a universal thing.
Absolutely.
It's not just people learning a new language.
Exactly.
And then he makes it even worse by saying, I'm terrible with names.
Oh.
Like adding insult to injury.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
But I think we can all relate.
For sure.
Like, who hasn't felt that way?
Yeah, it's like admitting a weakness.
Totally. And terrible with is a really useful phrase.
Yeah, you can use it for all sorts of things.
Like, I'm terrible with directions, or I'm terrible with technology.
Exactly.
It's a good way to express, like, your Achilles heel.
Yeah, for sure.
So we've kind of seen how this conversation unfolds.
Right.
But what can we learn from it?
Good question.
I noticed some interesting phrases about location that popped up.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Like around here and around the corner.
Yeah, those are really useful for describing where things are.
Exactly.
And they can be tweaked to have slightly different meanings.
Like around here is kind of general,
Right.
but right around the corner is
Yeah.
much more specific.
Exactly.
So even though this encounter starts off awkwardly,
Yeah,
it actually offers some valuable insights into everyday English.
I agree.
And we've already picked up on some handy phrases and tips.
For sure.
And I'm excited to see what else we discover as we go deeper.
Me too.
So what else can we learn from this awkward encounter?
Well, one thing that I think is really interesting is the way Nick uses fillers.
Fillers. Like,
Exactly, those little words and phrases that we often try to avoid.
right, because they make us sound less fluent.
Yeah, a lot of people think that, but actually using fillers in the right way can actually make you sound more natural.
More natural.
Really? Yeah, because native speakers use them all the time. It's part of how we speak naturally.
So it's not about like eliminating fillers altogether.
No, not at all. It's about using them strategically.
Okay, so how can we do that?
Well, for example, if someone asks you a question and you need a moment to think, you could say something like, well, let me see.
Right, that gives you a little bit of time to gather your thoughts.
Exactly. And it sounds more natural than just staying silent.
That makes sense.
What else? Another thing that can help is actually using a bit of redundancy.
Redundancy. Isn't that like repeating yourself?
Yeah, basically. But in spoken English, a little bit of redundancy can actually be helpful.
Really?
How so? Well, it can make your meaning clearer, and it can also make you sound more natural.
Okay, I'm not sure I get it. Can you give me an example?
Sure. So instead of just saying, I'm tired, you could say, I'm tired, I need to go to bed.
Okay, I see. So you're kind of emphasizing the point by saying it in two different ways.
Exactly. And it sounds more natural than just saying, I'm tired.
That's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's one of those things that you don't really notice until you start paying attention to how native speakers actually talk.
Okay, so fillers and redundancy. What else?
Another important aspect of fluency is intonation and rhythm.
Oh, yeah, like how your voice rises and falls when you speak.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Some people are naturally good at this, but it's also something that you can practice.
Okay. Any tips for that?
Well, one thing you can do is listen to how native speakers talk. Pay attention to how they emphasize certain words and how they pause between phrases.
Right. So it's not just about the words themselves, it's about how you deliver them.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like adding music to your speech.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
So we've talked about fillers, redundancy, and intonation. What about mistakes?
Mistakes. Well, everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers.
Right. but it can be embarrassing when you're trying to speak fluently.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But the important thing is to not let mistakes stop you from speaking.
So what should you do if you make a mistake?
Well, one thing you can do is simply correct yourself.
Like, oops, I meant to say.
Exactly. It shows that you're aware of the mistake and that you care about speaking accurately.
Okay. But doesn't that interrupt the flow of the conversation?
It can a little bit, but it's usually better to correct yourself than to just keep going with the mistake.
Right, because then people might not understand what you're trying to say.
Exactly.
What else can you do?
Another thing you can do is ask for clarification. If you didn't understand something, or if you're not sure if you said something correctly, you can always ask the other person to repeat it or to explain it in a different way.
Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes I feel embarrassed to admit that I didn't understand something.
I know it can be tough. But remember, most people are happy to help if you just ask.
Okay, so it's better to ask than to just pretend that you understand.
Exactly.
And it's a good opportunity to learn something new.
That's right.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Fillers, redundancy, intonation mistakes, and asking for clarification.
Yeah, it's all part of becoming a more fluent speaker.
And it's all about being comfortable with making mistakes and not being afraid to ask for help.
Exactly.
So what's the key takeaway here?
I think the most important thing is to remember that fluency isn't about perfection.
It's not about never making mistakes.
No, it's about being able to communicate effectively even when you do make mistakes.
So it's more about confidence than accuracy.
In a way, yes. It's about being able to express yourself clearly and naturally without worrying too much about making mistakes.
That makes sense. So it's about being comfortable with the language and being able to use it to connect with other people.
Exactly.
That's a great message to end on. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear what you think about active listening. Active listening.
Yeah.
That's definitely important.
Yeah, it's a huge part of fluency.
But how does it relate to, like, speaking fluently?
Well, when you're actively listening, you're not just hearing the words.
Right.
You're paying attention to the other person's tone of voice, their body language, their facial expressions.
So you're really trying to understand what they're saying.
Exactly. And when you do that, you can respond in a more meaningful way.
Which makes you a better communicator.
Right. And it also shows the other person that you're interested in what they have to say.
Which is important for building rapport.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how can we become better active listeners?
Well, one thing you can do is practice paraphrasing.
Paraphrasing. Like repeating what the other person said in your own words.
Exactly. It shows that you're listening and that you understand.
And it also gives the other person a chance to clarify if you didn't get something quite right.
Right.
What else?
Another good tip is to ask clarifying questions.
Like, what do you mean by that?
Exactly. Or can you give me an example?
Right. Those kinds of questions show that you're engaged in the conversation.
Yeah, and they can also help you to understand the other person's perspective better.
So active listening is really about being present in the conversation.
Exactly. It's about focusing on the other person and trying to understand what they're saying.
And it's a skill that can help you in all aspects of your life.
Absolutely. Not just when you're speaking English.
Wow. This has been such a fascinating deep dive.
I agree.
We've learned so much about fluency.
It's not just about grammar and vocabulary.
Right? It's also about confidence, connection, and active listening.
Exactly.
So to wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this episode?
I think the most important thing is to remember that fluency is a journey.
Not a destination.
Right. It's about constantly learning and improving.
And it's about being comfortable with making mistakes.
And not being afraid to ask for help.
Exactly. So keep practicing, keep learning, and most importantly, keep having fun with English.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into fluency.
It was my pleasure.
And until next time, keep those conversations flowing.